I've got a slide just to set context, but before I do that, I'm just going to start with a picture. Who knows what that is? It's not a trick question. What's that? I think it's a pressure gauge. Yeah. Is it a water meter? Well, I googled pressure gauge, so let's just pretend it's a pressure gauge, Steve. So what was that, Steve? There's a plumber, a qualified plumber here. You're just the father of a qualified plumber. You don't count. That's a pressure gauge. You can bank it. Anyway, let's just pretend it's a pressure gauge. I think Josh is just being nice. And the reason I put it up there is because I do think it's always good when we look at these different, biblical lessons, whether it's the Gospels or the Acts or whatever. Always be trying to look for practical lessons for ourselves. And, when I sort of boil this chapter down, I see lessons around this theme here, which is we will encounter pressure in our lives, especially if we choose to stand up for, religious things of the Bible, not the world's most popular sort of approach to life these days. Pressure will come. Pressure will come as we see it comes on the Apostle Paul to conform to certain things, do things certain ways. And what we find in this record, and it just stands out so nicely, and it's a string of chapters. I think chapter 22, 23, 24, they're all a bit the same in this way. You just see Paul, he is under pressure. And he's being opposed by people who are also under pressure for different reasons. And it's just fascinating to look at how they react to that situation. This very stark contrast. You see good ways to cope with pressure, and you'll see in Paul, that's Paul, in the Pharisees and the Sadducees and a few other people, there's some not so good ways to react to pressure and cope with it, and it's all laid bare in the record. So, we'll try and think about those things as we go through. Okay, but just in terms of an overview of this chapter, we are going to focus on the chapter. I think the way we're approaching it this year is we're trying to sort of do one chapter at a time, take it step by step. I'm going to try and stick pretty much to chapter 23 on that basis. That chapter is, you can break it into different pieces, but I've sort of broken it into three pieces just to give you a feel for where we're heading. So the first section, really we see Paul, it's introduced with the very last verse of chapter 22, but you sort of see up to the verse 11 of chapter 23, you see that Paul is pretty much hauled in front of the Jewish council, and he is going to be tried for treason. So quite an action-packed commencement to the chapter. We then go on to find that doesn't actually pan out the way the Jewish council liked, as we'll see. We then find that we're introduced to this group of 40-plus conspirators who decide to take matters in their own hands, and they are going to kill Paul. Okay, they've figured out, they've hatched a plan to actually just cut through, the sham trial, which is what was happening early in the chapter, and just kill him straight out. Then we see how that plan, as you move into the sort of third quarter of the chapter, that sort of unraveled, didn't really work out for them, and Paul finds himself sort of dodging that bullet and then getting shipped off to Caesarea to be tried again by a Roman, in this case Felix, Roman representative. So that's pretty much the chapter. And chapter 24 is then that trial with Felix, which has some of the same themes actually, but we won't deal with that. That'll be next time. Okay, so that's just an overview of what, and I'll just look to cover those events, and we'll talk through sort of what's going on in the record and perhaps draw some attention to what it might mean for us as we do that. Okay. But before we sort of start looking at the trial, I do want to just set a little bit of context, because chapter 23 of Acts really does build straight on top of 22. Now, the whole book of Acts is just it's one great big action-packed story. It just keeps rolling. But 22 really does set the scene for 23. So I just want to go through a little bit of context setting as to, how does Paul end up getting hauled in front of the Jewish council in the first place? Why would they do that? Well, the reason was, it starts at the start of, or the middle of chapter 21, where we've seen in this year how Paul does these missionary journeys, first, second, third, and at the end of the third missionary journey, where he's been collecting money for a poor fund, the Jerusalem Poor Fund, we find him at the start of chapter 21, sort of arriving with his companions with a massive, as it were, bag of money, and they kind of dump it on the desk of the Jerusalem meeting, or the group of believers in Jerusalem. And it should have been a really nice scene. It probably was, but it didn't last very long, because almost immediately they sort of say, thank you, brother. However, and the however was, there was people in Jerusalem, including amongst the believers, but also amongst the Jewish leadership, who just did not like Paul. And the reason they did not like Paul, and in fact they couldn't stand Paul, was because he was perceived to be too pro-Gentile. The Gentiles, people like us, non-Jews, with that kind of anti the law of Moses, and they didn't like that. They weren't big fans of Gentiles. They were big fans of the law of Moses, and so Paul was kind of just a big problem for them. He was an ex-Pharisee, so had a lot of credibility, and he was just a big problem for the Jewish leadership, because he was, by this stage, outrageously popular amongst some people who wanted to listen to the Bible, and he was preaching with tremendous success. He was turning the world on its head, like city to city to city. He had just flipped them on their heads, and it was causing a lot of stress to a lot of people. And now he's in Jerusalem, which is their home ground, and this is not a person they wanted to see there. And so you get the spirit of this in verse 21 of Acts 21. This is the leaders of the believers in Jerusalem talking to Paul. They said, look, I hate to break it to you, thanks for the money, but because we're starving, because they were, that there was a drought. However, they are informed of thee, thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying they ought not to circumcise their children, neither walk after the custom. They're saying, well, unfortunately, the money's good, but there's a lot of people who are upset about you, because the word on the street, Paul, is you are going around saying you don't have to keep the law of Moses, which was actually true. You didn't have to keep the law of Moses, and he does teach that. But that he wasn't as he wasn't saying you couldn't keep the law of Moses. He's just saying, well, strictly speaking, no, you don't. And they did not like that. And that was sort of where his troubles began. He finds himself having to sort of go off to the temple to comply with the Mosaic law, to keep up appearances as much as anything. But even that, even though he was trying to do the right thing, trying to sort of calm people down a little bit, show them he wasn't completely anti the law of Moses, he ends up in a mess there. They go after him again, accuse him of bringing in Gentiles into the wrong part of the temple. That blows up. We see this in verse 28. This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against people in the law and in this place, and has further brought Greeks also into the temple. He brought Greeks into the temple. How dare he do that? They did not like that. Okay, so this causes a huge kerfuffle, and it kind of culminates in he gets onto the steps of the castle. So I'll show you some photos in a minute, but adjacent to the temple, there was this massive temple in Jerusalem at the time, an incredible structure, which is gone now because it got destroyed in AD 70. But the archaeologists know what it looked like. It was impressive, and sort of bolted on to the one of the corners of the Jewish temple was this castle, or it's called Antonia Fortress, and it's a big. We'll see in the picture in a minute. Big fortress. That was where there was armed guards who were presumably posted there by the Romans to make sure the Jews didn't get too out of hand in the temple. Paul gets sort of pulled out of this messy scene by the Romans up onto the steps of that castle, and he gives a speech. And in that speech, it's all kind of going okay. People are listening to him, they're putting up with him, but then it all just unravels when he says this. Verse 21 of Acts 22, he says, depart, for I will send thee. So this is Paul recounting an instruction he's received. Depart, for I'll send thee far unto the Gentiles. And that word, him saying that the salvation of God could come to Gentiles, who they viewed as second-class citizens, to say the least, the Jews did. That just triggered them right off. That was the end. They gave him an audience unto the word Gentiles, and then that was it. It flipped a switch, and they lifted up their voices and said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live." So because he suggested that Gentiles, which I'm pretty sure most folks in this room, there might be some Jews here, I don't know, but I think most people are non-Jewish, so Gentiles, because the idea that people like us could be partakers of the salvation of God was so repulsive to some of the Jewish people at that time that they wanted to kill Paul. Now, there was probably some history here. There was baggage Paul brought along. He had a bad reputation with them for these reasons. I don't think it would have been just this word, but that word set them off at that instant. And this is how he ends up, there's this domino events, he ends up getting dragged into the Jewish council. He's handed over by the Romans to get a fair trial. The Romans thought that was fair enough, give him a fair trial under his own leadership. And that's where we get to in Acts 23. And that's just an artist's representation. It's actually not the best but it's a representation of the Jewish council. The reason I say it's not the best is because it's sort of, how many people are in the council there? Maybe 20. There was about 71 Jewish leaders or elders who ran the Jewish council. They were a mixture of what's called Sanhedrin and Pharisees, who were quite senior leaders, powerful leaders in the Jewish community, but somewhat differed in their religious outlooks, which we'll see in the record in a minute when we read through it, because Paul kind of uses a divide and conquer tactic, really, on that basis, leveraging the fact that they believe different things. We'll see that in a minute. But yeah, it's just an artist's representation of what the council roughly might have looked like as Paul was hauled in front of them. Okay, so this council, 71 leaders, as I said, and I think, again, we're going to try and think about the practical lessons. Just, you think about this record from their perspective. The Jewish council were, I think, under a lot of pressure, okay? This individual, Paul, was absolutely lethal. Like, he was an ex-Pharisee, he had massive credibility with people. He was extremely proficient in the scriptures, in the Bible, and he had gone from hunting down and killing Christians to preaching Christ. He was their worst nightmare, okay? And he was turning cities on their head. He was wrecking synagogues as far as they're concerned. And here he is again on the steps of the castle preaching, he's going to go and convert the Gentiles, and they just want him dead. Realistically, they just wanted him dead, a lot of them. Not all of them, because there was a few people like Nicodemus, perhaps, amongst them who were converts, actually, who were more sympathetic. But a lot of them just wanted Paul gone because he was creating all sorts of problems in the Roman world for them, and he needed to stop. So they're looking for solutions, okay? This guy's a traitor, and he needs to go. So this is where it gets interesting, is if you look at, let's just read a few verses and we'll sort of summarise it. Say, chapter 23. Let's see how this plays out. We'll just read the first few verses. Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, "Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day." Okay, so he says, what's that? In English, I don't know how many is in Greek, but all of 10 words or something like that. So he gets a sentence out, basically says, look, I'm happy with how I've been operating. I don't know what I've done wrong. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. The high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. So not one question asked, not one sort of, not a question, no cross-examination, nothing. He just says, basically, how dare you suggest you're innocent? And he gets him belted in front of everybody. So this is a proper judicial, or it's meant to be a proper judicial system. Can you imagine if you went down to the courts there in Adelaide, you're on, I don't know, some serious traffic charge or something, and you sort of say, and it's a false accusation, it's actually with someone else's car, and you sort of say to the judge, well, it wasn't wasn't actually me in the car that ran the red light. And the judge says, and they bang. Oh, that seems a bit over the top. I mean, you just think, this is crazy. This was an absolute sham, okay? So he gets belted simply because he suggests he might be innocent. Then Paul said, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, for you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? And then there's this argument around, well, you're not supposed to revile the high priest, which he wasn't, and he says, well, I didn't know it was the high priest, and so on. But I just want to look at a couple of things here, okay? So how do they operate? How do they cope with the pressure? How are the Jewish leadership dealing with it? Well, the high priest just gets violent, okay? He's not getting the results he wants out of Paul. He's not getting him to shift in the direction he wants, so he just belts him, okay? So I'm sure that's an obvious lesson for us all, but you know, we try not to get violent, certainly, or aggressive or that sort of thing to coerce someone to get in line with our position. He just wanted him to say, look, I'm wrong, I'm on board with the Pharisees and Sadducees now, it's all good. That's what they wanted, and they would do anything to get him to do that, or kill him if he wouldn't go there. But you know, it's just not the right way to influence. But that's what they were looking to do. Verse 10, let's just read verse 10. It's the same theme. Now, when there arose a great dissension, the commander, fearing that lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him into the barracks. Okay, so it all sort of culminates, it gets a bit ugly. Paul does this tactic, which maybe he regrets later. He suggests in chapter 24 he regrets, where he sort of gets the Pharisees and the Sadducees to go after each other by bringing the resurrection into the debate, because Sadducees didn't believe in resurrection, Pharisees did believe in resurrection. Paul makes a statement about the resurrection, and it sort of played out quite well for him in the short term. They start arguing, the attention's drawn away from him, which works for him. And then, but notwithstanding that, the commander, verse 10, still sees this could end up in Paul getting pretty much torn to pieces, is what it says. So he just gets him out of there. This has got to stop. This is not going to end well. This trial, it's not going to be a fair. He's figured out at this point it's not going to be a fair trial. Gets him out, and because he genuinely believed he could get torn to pieces. That's the language. You know, they were tough operators, these Jewish leaders. So again, not the ideal way to react to pressure. The other thing I find interesting in here is you sort of read it carefully. You see it in verse 2, you see it in verse 4. They sort of use gang-up tactics, okay? So the high priest stood by... High priest Ananias commanded those, so you sort of got plural, who stood by him, singular, to strike him on the mouth. Verse 4, those who stood by, plural, said, do you revile God's high priest? So it doesn't say how many people there are, but there are multiple people pretty much standing right over next to Paul, ready to belt him, and Paul is on his own, okay? I don't see anyone on the record who's sort of standing by Paul's side or standing in the gallery saying, hey, it's not fair. You know, he is getting pummeled on his own by multiple people, okay? So that's another, these are sort of negative lessons. We're going to see the positive in how Paul operates in a minute. But this is another sort of human characteristic when we are trying to influence somebody. You see school kids do it, right? Like adults can do it too. It's a gang-up tactic. You know, I will build a coalition, or I'll get these guys over here, and we'll go and beat up that kid over there, because it's just easy, right? But it is not a godly or a nice way to operate. You know, we don't need to gang up like that. That is how the Pharisees worked. Safety in numbers, confidence in numbers. Paul on his own, getting destroyed in front of all these people, just like, unfortunately, like what happened to Jesus prior to this. But that's because he has faith. That's because he knows God's on his side. And that's the difference. These men were meant to be godly, but they didn't really have that much faith in God, because if they did, why did they need to gang up like that? So you can see again the different ways of approaching pressure. Okay, and we've talked about that. Paul pretty much does that divide and conquer thing. Verse 6, when Paul perceived that one part was Sadducees, the other Pharisees, he cried out, "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope and the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged." And when he had said this, the dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. And they ended up arguing amongst themselves. It worked well for Paul, but he does say in, I think it's chapter 24, I've got the reference here, chapter 24, verse 21. I'll try not to steal the thunder of whoever's doing it next time, but it just sort of rounds it out. He does actually say later, when he's in front of Felix at his next trial, unless it is for this one statement, among them I cried out, standing among them, concerning the resurrection of the dead, I am judged by you this day. Okay, so he seems to be putting his hand up there and saying, look, maybe I shouldn't have done that. So he sort of operates on very high moral ground. He regrets that he sparked a fight between them. They didn't regret literally belting him. So, very different moral standard that Paul operated under. Okay, so that's the trial. That's the council. That's how it played out. In the end, he just gets dragged out because the Romans are worried he's going to get torn to pieces. That's sort of how it ends. Now, just as I said, I'll just show you some photos of this. We talked about that castle. So you look on the top right, that's the Antonia fortress. So this photo is obviously not a photo of the actual temple, because there wasn't much photography back then, and it was torn down in AD 70. But has anyone seen, this is a model, this is in Jerusalem. I haven't been there, but I believe it's there. Anyone seen it? You've seen it? You've seen it? Too. Yeah. I don't know if I trust you though, because you thought that thing was a flow meter, right? That pressure gauge. Yeah, so 2 people have been there. And it is, I don't know, the temple, it looks like it's about that big from the photo, like those towers there. So it's a pretty big layout of ancient Jerusalem. Anyway, it gives you a sense of how the temple was laid out. The temple, you can see the little gold doors there. The temple was an enormous structure that was built for the Jews by the Romans. But, the castle at the top right wasn't tiny either. And that's where these Roman centurions that we read about in Acts 23 operated out of. And the captain Lysias, will come across him in a minute. That's where he was based out of. And I think there's a close-up here in a minute. Yeah, so that's it there. So those steps there, that would have been where Paul gave his original speech that got him in so much trouble, where he was kind of pro-Gentile. And yeah, that's where he now, for the second time, he's just about to start a huge fight. The Romans again take him back there to get him away from the Jews so he doesn't get torn up. So he's back to the castle. Okay. Now, at this point, we encounter in Acts 23 this group of, it says over 40, so however many, but more than 40, a pretty big group of Jews who, the record reads to me like you've just had this trial that the council, it didn't actually go that well for the Jews because they ended up at each other's throats. They didn't, if there was an intention to get really, really violent with Paul, well, they didn't manage that either because he got pulled out of by the Romans. So, it's not going that well for the Jews. And you can imagine that possibly is the reason why the record pulls across to these really hardcore Jews who get together and they strike a deal. And the deal is they are going to kill Paul. And just to sort of make sure and show their commitment to that, their joint commitment to that objective, they say they won't eat. They won't eat until they've done it, which is a risky thing to vow, right? To vow that you're not going to eat until you've killed someone. That's, it's brave, maybe a bit stupid, but brave as well. Okay, so this is the vow. It's quite fat, but it shows to you. I mean, this is a real historical record. The book of Acts. It shows to you how they were extremely determined to sort this out. They were extremely upset with Paul, and they just wanted him dead. Like, he was doing so much damage to Judaism as they saw it, that the best thing for everybody was just to get rid of him. Better dead. Which is, again, that some of you who might be familiar with the Gospels, you think about the justification the Jewish leadership used to kill Jesus was not dissimilar. What did they say? Well, it's expedient that one man should die for the people. Okay, so they figured out, I think it was Ananias, was it Caiaphas or Ananias who said that? Someone's nodding, I don't know. It was one of the two high priests. Literally said that, and it makes sense on a logical level. Look, this guy he's going to get us in trouble with the Romans. He's causing huge headaches. It's just best for everybody if he just dies. Now, that wasn't a very spiritual or godly thought process, but it's logical. And of course, it blew up in their face because God was watching over the whole thing, but on a logical plane, fair enough. And that's pretty much where these guys are at. They're saying, he's just got to go. Like, it's just ripping us apart, ripping the Jewish world apart. Let's just kill him, just like Jesus. So that's where they get to. So you come to verse 12. Yeah. Actually, we'll read from... Yeah, let's just read from verse 11 of chapter 23. So after the council, Paul's back in the castle. He's in his room. And it says, the following night, the Lord stood by him. His room was a prison, by the way. He wasn't sort of a welcome guest. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, so this is a vision, you'd presume, of Jesus speaking to him to encourage him, okay? So I talked about how he was on his own. Everyone's there belting him. He's on his own. What a shocking scene. Imagine trying to get through that. Well, the reason he got through it is because he had faith in God. He had faith in his Lord Jesus Christ, that he was actually there watching over him, perhaps an angel as well. And this is borne out later on as he gets this message. Be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified of me, or for me rather, in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness in Rome. Okay, so it's a very short, but it's quite a very constructive, positive message that he's getting here, which is essentially that don't stress, be of good cheer, don't just be happy, because just as you've preached in Jerusalem, as you did on the steps of that castle, and as you did stay in the council, good news, you're going to get to do it again in Rome. And it wasn't, and he meant it, because he knew that's what motivated Paul. Paul loved preaching. Paul loved telling people about the gospel. And that was the simple exhortation or encouragement that he received from God, which is, don't worry about all that. Don't worry about they want to belt you, and they belted you. He doesn't even acknowledge that happened, right? Because he knows Paul's thinking on a high level. He's just saying, don't worry about it. You're going to Rome. Rome's a big city, and you're going to preach there. Won't that be great? And that's all Paul needed. That got Paul excited. That got Paul motivated, and that's what, amongst other things, perhaps got him through this difficult situation. He just thought differently to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He was motivated by different things, and he's a fantastic example. Anyway, verse 12, when it was day, some of the Jews banded together. So this is the vow, right? And bound themselves under an oath, saying they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. Now, there were more than 40 who had formed this conspiracy. They came to the chief priests and elders and said, we have bound ourselves under a great oath that we will eat nothing until we've killed Paul. So, pretty bold. They committed publicly amongst themselves, until he dies, we do not eat. And, a bit of a spoiler alert, he doesn't die. He dies later, but they don't kill him. Do you think they starved to death? I think they, found a loophole. I don't know. It's interesting. I'm guessing they probably didn't starve to death, but I've got no idea. But I mean, what a predicament. Once he got away, which he does, you just imagine, you're a Jew. Vows a pretty big deal as a Jew. You've made this big deal of this vow. Paul's gone. He's in a prison in Caesarea, which is where we'll see he ends up. What are you going to do? Who's going to be the first to eat? You're going to eat? So it's just interesting to look at. That is the extent of their zeal, but it's also the extent, I suppose, of their overconfidence in their just cause. They were so confident they were right. They were so confident that he needed to die. That was the best thing. They weren't stupid. They thought they were doing the right thing. They were so completely overconfident and unwilling to be sort of maybe guided by God that this wasn't actually what he wanted, that they did that. They made this crazy vow that I don't know if anyone plays billiards, but they snookered themselves. They completely trapped themselves with this vow. So got to be careful about committing to things like that. Okay. So they make this vow. Verse 16 of the same chapter suggests that the Jewish leaders, the council, don't seem to have been directly part of this. They're sort of, it puts them a little bit separately in the record, but they certainly didn't dislike it when it was brought to them. Okay, so they were what we would call complicit. They were on board with this when it came to them. So when Paul's, verse 15. Now therefore, together with the council, suggests the commander that he has to be brought down to you tomorrow. So this is how they're going to say, look, tell him to come down as though you were going to make further inquiry. So this is this group of 40 speaking to the Jewish leadership, convince the commander to send him back. You're going to just hear him out, get a bit more of this, flesh out the trial a bit more. And at that point, we're going to kill him. Probably, I assume, somewhere between the castle and the temple, so it wasn't very far. They were just lying in wait with swords and daggers or whatever, and they were just going to jump on him and kill him. And the response of the Jews in verse 15, 16, the leadership is they were totally on board with this. It wasn't their idea, but they thought it was a great idea. Okay, so they got on board with it, and so now you've got this to the I suppose the unspiritual eye. Paul's dead, right? This is it's all over. You're just sort of watching down, thinking, well, you got the Jewish leadership want him dead. You got these 40 armed men plus who want him dead, and who've vowed they won't even eat until he's dead. So that's pretty good motivation. So in other words, either he dies or they die, right? So they're highly, highly, highly motivated to kill him. The Jewish leadership are on board. Shouldn't be hard to trick the Romans to send him down for just a bit more of a fair hearing at the Jewish council, and he should be dead. But the nephew thwarts. Okay, so Paul had a nephew, and somehow the nephew finds out about this plot. Okay, and this to me is another nice little lesson in this chapter, and it's not the only time we see it in the book of Acts where it doesn't refer to angels, but when I look at a record like this, I think, wow, it's difficult not to suspect that God was, the architect of the events that occurred here, because really Paul gets pulled out of the fire just because their nephew just happened to overhear this plot, and from there the whole perfect plan of these 40 would-be murderers, it just falls to pieces just because of one thing. One person, pretty insignificant person, gets some intelligence, passes it on, and the whole thing falls to pieces, as I said. So you see this in verse 16. When Paul's sister's son heard of the ambush, he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. So the nephew overhears, just happens to be in the right place at the right time. What are the odds of that? But overhears, goes to the barracks and talks to Paul. And Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, "Take this young man to the commander for he has something to tell him." So he took him, verse 18, brought him to the commander and said, "Paul the prisoner called me to him and asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to say to you." Then the commander took him by the hand, went aside and asked him privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" He said, "The Jews have agreed to ask that you bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire more fully about him. But do not yield to them, for more than 40 of them lie in wait, and so on, okay? So he just blows the lid on the whole thing. He tells the commander of the barracks that the whole thing, and the commander had probably seen enough in how they'd operated. This is where there's kind of stupid. The violence they showed in that sham trial, it was so obviously unjust that he can probably look at this and think, it sounds kind of crazy. Like this story, this guy's telling me this crazy story about some people are going to ambush Paul and murder him, and they've made this vow. And like that's not really that believable. It's kind of crazy, but he believes them. Why does he believe them? Well, probably because they'd been slapping around Paul in the trial. He now knew they weren't really above board, these Jews. He's suspicious, and so he believes this. And he really does believe it because he reacts strongly. He listens to this and he thinks, this is credible. I think they could do it. And so what does he do? He gets this massive armed guard. He calls 2 centurions. So they prepare 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen. So what's that, 470, to go to Caesarea the 3rd hour of the night, and provide mounts to set Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor. Okay, so he is going to evacuate Paul with 400. Did I add up correctly? I think it's 470. That's a lot of. These are professional soldiers versus 40 kind of crazy armed Jews. Now he is taking this extremely seriously, and he is going to evacuate Paul out of Jerusalem, get him up to Caesarea, to Felix, to have hopefully, he's hoping, a more reasonable trial with a less biased judge, which is interesting because it doesn't quite pan out that way. But yeah, someone else can tell you that next time. But he takes it very seriously. This is a serious threat, and Paul is pulled out of the fire. Just because, the domino, there's a sequence of dominoes, but the first domino to fall is this nephew just happens to overhear. And that's it. That's all it took. And that's why, I personally, it's not definitive, but when I look at that, I think, wow, I think God was superintending this and pulling a few strings because really how else would it have, it just seems so unlikely otherwise that the nephew would have overheard. Okay, now, the positive, I talked about, we've sort of beat up on the Pharisees and the Sadducees a bit, but, the record, I mean, this is the thing I like about the Bible generally. I'll try not to go off on too much of a tangent, but, often the Bible will hit you up, particularly the prophets at the end of the Old Testament, will hit you up with some real tough messages, pretty negative messages, if you like. But often those passages, towards the end or somewhere interspersed, you get these beautiful positive verses. Sometimes the most positive passages in the Bible are sort of twinned with some of the most negative, as if God sort of knows we need a bit of balance. And I find that in this chapter as well. You see the negativity, and it's not fun to read about how the Pharisees did things. There's some negative lessons there for us to say, okay, that's not how I want to operate. But we don't just want to think how we don't want to operate in life. We want to think about how we do want to operate, and that's where Paul is so fantastic in the record, because Paul shows us how we should operate. Okay, chapter 24, you really see him, Paul just does some amazing things in that chapter. But even in this chapter, you see a couple of things. The main thing I see is in chapter 23 is in verse 11, just the fact that he gets this message. And on the back of that, he's just been beaten up in front of a room full of people, and that simple message from the Lord, as it says, I assume that's Jesus, is enough to get him through the night, to get him up in the morning and pushing forward and happily move on to his subsequent trial in Caesarea. Just the fact that you're going to get to preach in Rome. Be of good cheer, you're going to get to preach in Rome. Now, as it turns out, that was going to be in a prison. He was imprisoned in Rome, but for Paul that was gold. He didn't care as long as he got to preach, and he preached there with tremendous success. That's all it took. He had faith in God. He trusted that God was watching over all this, and that it would work for good. It would somehow work for good. And if he lost his life, well, he lost his life. He'd be resurrected. He didn't care. But he knew that wasn't going to happen. His life was actually not going to be taken anytime soon, because he was off to Rome to preach. And he just shows this beautiful, faithful obedience as he just, the Acts record progresses on, and he just rolls with it beautifully. He doesn't try to manipulate like the Pharisees or get violent or ugly or whatever. He just rolls with the hand of God that's guiding him on this beautiful path. It's a nice example. And bear in mind, this is on the back of what he's done in chapter 22, where, how did he even get into this mess? He got into this mess because he was trying to do the right thing and sort of show a bit of respect for the law, remember, in Acts 21. And then, there's that kerfuffle, he gets pulled out into the steps. And at that point, when he's put out into the steps, he spared the violence that was coming to him by the Romans. He could have just said, okay, let's go. But he sort of says, I imagine the previous speaker pointed this out, he just said, I just want to say a little speech to the people. And he gets up there and you think, I can just imagine. I mean, I don't imagine he did. But if it was me, I'd be thinking, should I? I've talked about this and that and preached a bit of that. Should I mention the Gentiles? That's really going to set them off. But I really should, because it's an important part of the gospel. But so I guess, And so he just drops it on the table. He says, and the Gentiles, they're going to be part of it too. Boom, nuclear blast, right? But he was courageous, right? He's a courageous, beautiful, faithful man. And it's such a contrast to how the Pharisees were operating. That is what Paul presents to us in the record in Acts 23 as to how we should try. We're not perfect, but we should. It's a good standard to try and attain to. We should try and be courageous, try and be brave, try and be honest about what we believe and stand up for it, even if we are that one person in a crowd who's looking like a bit of a beacon, like Paul did. It's okay. That's okay. It worked out for him, as it will for anybody who does that. Okay. So that was the plot to kill. And then we talked about the armed guard. Essentially, the chapter tapers off with Lysias, the commander, just says, I've got to get him out. He sets up this huge escort, military escort, to get him from Jerusalem to Caesarea unscathed, which it did work. So we have that other trial. And with that, he sends this letter to Felix. So Felix is the governor who sits in Caesarea, and he's looking to sort of, I don't think that he was necessarily trying to do like what Pontius Pilate did, wash his hands of it. And I think Lysias actually reads in the record to me like, it's funny, there's a lot of bad people in this record, aren't really doing the right thing. Paul's obviously a big exception, but I actually think Lysias is in the ballpark as well. Like he's quite a brave man, and he's trying to do the right thing. He's trying to treat Paul fairly for the most part, I think. And now he just wants him to go off there and A, not be murdered, that's important, and B, maybe get a fair trial, which he clearly couldn't get in Jerusalem. So this is what he says. He says, Claudius Lysias, under the most excellent governor Felix, sendeth greeting. This man was taken of the Jews and should have been killed of them. So he straight out says to Felix, they were going to kill him. I'm pretty confident they were going to kill him. Then came I with an army and rescued him, having understood he was a Roman, and when I should have known the cause wherefore they accused him, I brought him forth into the council, whom I perceived to be accused of questions of their law, but to have nothing laid to his charge, worthy of death or bond. So he says, I went to the trial, I didn't hear anything worthy of death, and to be honest, I didn't hear anything that he shouldn't even be imprisoned overnight. There's just nothing. I think that's, this is showing that to put this in writing, put it to Felix, probably not the most popular thing as far as the Jews are concerned, and Paul a bit of a head start so that Felix knew that, well, this is one, he wasn't so bad. How's that? You hear me? Yeah. Oop. Broke the old microphone. Okay. So when it was told me how the Jews had laid wait for them, I sent straightway to thee, gave commandment to his accusations, also to say before thee what they had said against him. Farewell. Okay. So, and that is pretty much the warm-up for chapter 24, where, what time we got? Yeah, we're out of time. So, yeah, next class, God willing, which is it next week, the next one? Acts 24? Yep. Yeah, so if you get along to that, you'll see how he does get to Caesarea, he does get there unscathed, and he does get another trial, which has the potential to be a fairer trial, but it's not really. So, yeah, interesting to see how that plays out next class, God willing.